Somewhere beneath the mud of a vanished world, or perhaps beneath nothing but legend, there may lie the remains of a boat built to outlast the end of everything. For thousands of years, in temples, in scripture, in cave paintings and clay tablets scattered across 3 continents, one story keeps returning. A flood so vast it erased the world. A man chosen to survive it. A vessel built by hand, carrying the last of everything worth saving. Is this only a story passed down to teach a lesson? Or did something real happen on this earth, so catastrophic that nearly every ancient civilization that ever wrote anything down felt compelled to remember it? Stay with us, because by the end of this film, you will understand exactly what archaeology has found, what it hasn't, and why one of humanity's oldest stories refuses to disappear. Nearly every ancient culture that left behind written records also left behind a flood story. That alone should stop you. The Sumerians wrote of it. The Babylonians wrote of it. The Hebrew Bible preserves it in careful detail, and the Qur'an, revealed over 1,000 years after the last Mesopotamian flood tablet was pressed into clay, tells the same essential story again, with its own emphasis, its own moral center, and its own prophet at its heart. Nu, known in English as Noah. This documentary is not here to prove or disprove anyone's faith. It's here to do something rarer than that. It's here to walk, carefully and honestly, through what we actually know. Ancient texts, excavated flood layers, satellite imagery, contested formations on a mountainside in eastern Turkey. Real archaeology, and the places where archaeology runs out and belief has to carry the rest. Let's begin where the story begins for over 1 billion people alive today, inside the Qur'an itself. The Qur'an devotes more verses to the story of Nuh than to almost any other prophet, spread across multiple chapters, most extensively in Surah Nuh, Surah Hud, and Surah Al-Araf. In the Quranic account, Nuh is sent by God to a people who have fallen into idol worship, warning them for what the text describes as 950 years, a span the Qur'an states explicitly in Surah Al-Ankabut. Nuh pleads with his people generation after generation, and generation after generation, they refuse to listen. Imagine that kind of patience. Not a single sermon, not a single decade, a lifetime measured in centuries spent trying to reach people who had already decided not to hear you. According to the Qur'an, only a small number of believers ever accepted Nuh's message. When God's judgment finally comes, the text describes it arriving through 2 forces at once: water bursting forth from the earth itself, and rain falling from a sky described as pouring down in torrents. Surah Al-Qamar describes the heavens opening with torrential water, and the earth bursting with springs, the waters meeting in a flood that the Qur'an says had already been decreed. Nuh is commanded to build a ship, constructed, the Qur'an says, under God's watchful guidance. Onto that ship, Nuh is instructed to bring his family, a pair of every kind of creature, and those who believed, though the text is clear that belief, not bloodline, determined who was saved. One of the most emotionally devastating moments in the entire Qur'an occurs here. Nuh's own son refuses to board, insisting he will climb a mountain to escape the water himself. Nuh calls out to him. The son refuses. And then, in a single verse, the water rises between them, and the son is lost. a moment the Qur'an describes with unflinching honesty, refusing to soften even a prophet's personal grief. It's worth sitting with that detail, because it tells you something about how the Qur'an chooses to tell this story. This isn't presented as a fairy tale with a clean, comfortable ending. It's presented as a real test, with real loss, even for the man God had chosen to carry his message. And then comes the verse many scholars consider one of the most poetically striking in the entire text. When the flood finally recedes, the Qur'an describes the earth being commanded to swallow its water, and the sky being commanded to withhold its rain. The water subsides. The ship comes to rest. And in Surah Hud, the Qur'an names the exact location where it settles: Mount al-Judi. We'll return to that mountain because it sits at the center of one of the most genuinely contested questions in this entire documentary. But first, we need to understand something crucial. This story didn't appear in isolation. Long before the Qur'an, long before the Hebrew Bible, other civilizations were already writing this same flood into their own clay tablets.
Around 4,000 years ago, in the region we now call Iraq, Sumerian and later Babylonian scribes were recording their own version of a catastrophic flood. The most complete surviving account comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian poem preserved on cuneiform tablets discovered in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, excavated by British archaeologists in the 19th century, and now held primarily in the British Museum. In that account, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god of an impending flood, instructed to build a massive vessel, and told to bring aboard his family and the seed of every living creature. The parallels are striking enough that when Assyriologist George Smith first translated the flood tablet in 1872, reading a Babylonian flood story astonishingly similar to the biblical account, he reportedly became so excited that he began tearing off his clothes in the middle of the British Museum. That detail isn't legend. It's recorded history, documented in the accounts of his own contemporaries, and it captures exactly how seismic this discovery felt to 19th century scholars encountering, for the first time, physical proof that flood traditions existed far outside the Bible alone. An earlier and even more detailed Mesopotamian flood account survives in the Atrahasis epic, another Babylonian text, in which the gods send a flood to reduce an overpopulated, noisy humanity, and a man named Atrahasis is instructed to build a boat to preserve life. Scholars studying these texts, including Assyriologists such as W. G. Lambert and Alan Millard, who produced the standard critical edition of Atrahasis, have long noted the layered literary relationship between these Mesopotamian flood accounts and the later biblical and Quranic narratives, without claiming direct one-to-one dependence between them. Here's where honesty matters most in this documentary. Historians and biblical scholars are not in full agreement about exactly how these ancient Near Eastern flood traditions relate to one another. Some argue the biblical account draws on a shared Mesopotamian literary and oral tradition common to the ancient Near East. Others emphasize the theological differences, particularly the shift from many capricious gods punishing a noisy humanity to a single God carrying out righteous judgment. What virtually every serious historian agrees on, regardless of their interpretation, is this: a shared memory of catastrophic flooding, severe enough to reshape entire mythologies, runs through cultures across ancient Mesopotamia and echoes far beyond it. And that echo doesn't stop at Mesopotamia's borders. Flood traditions appear, independently developed, in cultures with no direct historical contact with the ancient Near East at all.
Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu, warned by a fish deity of a coming deluge and instructed to build a boat. Greek mythology tells of Deucalion, who survives a flood sent by Zeus by building an ark on the instruction of his father. Indigenous oral traditions across parts of the Americas, Australia, and East Asia contain their own flood narratives, developed in complete isolation from the Fertile Crescent. Anthropologists and historians of religion debate exactly why flood myths appear so widely across unrelated human cultures. Some point to the simple, universal human experience of catastrophic local flooding, a disaster nearly every early river valley civilization would have encountered repeatedly, providing fertile ground for similar stories to develop independently. Others argue certain traditions may share deeper historical roots we've yet to fully trace. What's not in serious dispute is the sheer breadth of the pattern itself. Few human stories appear so consistently across so many unconnected civilizations as the memory of a flood that once nearly ended everything. So, if this story appears almost everywhere, does that mean archaeology has found the flood itself? This is where we have to slow down, because the honest answer is far more nuanced than any headline promising "Noah's Ark found" will ever admit. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley led excavations at the ancient Sumerian city of Ur in what is now southern Iraq. Digging deep beneath the city's later occupation layers, Woolley's team discovered a thick layer of water-laid silt, roughly 8 feet deep in places, sitting directly between clearly defined layers of human occupation. Woolley concluded he had found physical evidence of a catastrophic local flood, and, in the excitement of the moment, publicly suggested it might be evidence for the biblical flood itself.
Later archaeological work complicated that conclusion considerably. Excavations at other nearby Mesopotamian sites, including Kish, Shuruppak, and Uruk, revealed flood layers of their own, but these layers date to different periods and don't align neatly with one another, suggesting a series of major but geographically limited regional flooding events across ancient Mesopotamia, rather than one single flood engulfing the entire region at once. Most archaeologists and historians today interpret Woolley's flood layer, and others like it, as strong physical evidence for a devastating regional flood, one severe enough to leave a permanent mark on the ground and, quite plausibly, on the cultural memory of the people who survived it. But mainstream archaeology stops well short of calling it proof of a single, worldwide deluge. There's another theory worth taking seriously, developed not by biblical archaeologists, but by marine geologists. In 1997, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed what's become known as the Black Sea Flood hypothesis, based on sediment cores and underwater surveys suggesting that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean sea levels breached a natural barrier at the Bosphorus, sending seawater catastrophically pouring into what was then a large freshwater lake, rapidly expanding it into the Black Sea we know today. Ryan and Pittman proposed this sudden dramatic inundation of coastal farmland could have seeded flood memories that spread outward through early agricultural communities across the region. It's a compelling hypothesis, and it has genuinely influenced how some historians think about the deep roots of flood memory in this part of the world. But it remains exactly that, a hypothesis, actively debated within the geological community, with some researchers supporting the scale and suddenness Ryan and Pittman describe, and others arguing the flooding, while real, was more gradual than their original model proposed. Science, done honestly, rarely closes the book this quickly, and this question hasn't been closed at all. So we have layered physical evidence, real regional floods, real catastrophic geological events,
real cultural memory encoded across a dozen ancient civilizations. What we don't have, and this is essential to say clearly, is a scientifically confirmed, single, global flood event matching every detail of any one religious tradition's account. That's not the same as saying nothing happened. It's saying the ground itself, so far, tells a story of serious, repeated, regionally devastating floods, rather than one tidy, singular catastrophe. Now let's turn to the mountain itself, because this is where the story gets its most dramatic and most contested modern chapter. The Qur'an names the resting place of Nuh's ship as Mount al-Judi. The Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, names the resting place as the mountains of Ararat, a plural phrase referring to a mountainous region rather than one single confirmed peak. Over centuries, two different traditions grew from these two texts, eventually converging on two very different mountains. Mount Ararat, the volcanic peak modern tradition most commonly points to, rises over 16,000 feet in eastern Turkey, near the borders of Armenia and Iran. This identification became especially popular in later Christian and Western tradition, particularly from the medieval period onward. Mount Judi, favored in the earliest Islamic tradition and named directly in the Qur'an, sits roughly 200 miles to the south, near the modern Turkish-Syrian-Iraqi border region, a lower, less dramatic mountain, but one with a documented history of local veneration stretching back centuries, including references in early Islamic geographical and historical writings, and even earlier mentions in some ancient Mesopotamian and Syriac Christian sources predating Islam. It's worth noting how old the Mount Judi identification actually is. Long before the rise of Islam, some ancient Near Eastern and early Christian writers, including certain Syriac church traditions, already associated the ark's resting place with this same southern mountain, a detail that gives the Quran's naming of al-Judi a genuine, deep historical resonance within the region's own pre-Islamic religious memory, rather than representing an entirely new geographic claim invented centuries after the events it describes.
So which mountain is correct? Modern historians and geographers generally treat this as an unresolved question of textual and regional tradition rather than something archaeology alone can settle, since no confirmed physical remains of any ancient vessel have been recovered at either location through peer-reviewed excavation. But one particular formation, on the slopes near Mount Ararat, has captured more public imagination and generated more controversy than almost any other site connected to this story. It's called the Durupınar Formation. In 1959, Turkish Army Captain İlhan Durupınar was reviewing aerial photographs of eastern Turkey when he noticed an unusual boat-shaped formation on a hillside roughly 12 miles south of Mount Ararat's peak, sitting at an elevation of nearly 6,000 feet. The formation measures approximately 538 feet long, a length that some researchers noted bears a striking numerical resemblance to the ark's dimensions as described in the book of Genesis, measured in ancient cubits. Since that discovery, the Durupınar site has drawn explorers, researchers, and no shortage of sensational claims. Various expeditions over the following decades, including work associated with researchers Ron Wyatt in the 1970s and 80s, claimed to have found evidence of ancient shipbuilding at the site, including metal fittings, petrified wood, and geological patterns some interpreted as evidence of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Here is where this documentary has to be direct with you, because this is exactly the kind of claim that spreads fastest online precisely because it feels so exciting. The overwhelming majority of professional geologists who have examined the Durupınar Formation, including researchers who published findings in peer-reviewed geological literature, have concluded that the formation is a natural geological structure most likely formed through a combination of mud flow
landslide activity, and the local geology of the region, rather than the fossilized or petrified remains of an ancient wooden vessel. Geologist Lawrence Collins, among others who have studied the site's rock composition directly, published analysis arguing the formation's internal structure is consistent with natural geological processes rather than shipbuilding. Claims of metal fittings, iron rivets, and specialized laboratory testing connected to the site have circulated widely in documentaries and online content for decades, but these claims have not been independently verified through peer-reviewed scientific publication in a way that has persuaded the broader geological or archaeological community. Independent researchers and journalists investigating some of these more sensational claims, including reporting connected to Ron Wyatt's expeditions specifically, have raised significant, documented concerns about the reliability of the evidence presented. None of this means the Durupınar Formation isn't a genuinely interesting site, geologically or historically. It means the honest, current scientific consensus does not support it as physical evidence of Noah's Ark, however visually striking its boat-like shape appears from above. A documentary that told you otherwise would be trading your trust for a few extra minutes of watch time. And that's not a trade this film is willing to make. So what about Mount Ararat itself? The peak where so many modern search expeditions have focused their attention for over a century. Since the 19th century, numerous expeditions have attempted to locate Ark remains on Ararat's slopes, drawn by local shepherd accounts, occasional claimed sightings of wooden structures beneath the mountain's permanent ice and snow, and a passionate, sincere desire among many searchers to find physical confirmation of their faith. Expeditions have used satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and direct mountaineering searches across multiple decades. Some of these expeditions have generated significant media attention. In 2010, a joint Turkish-Chinese team announced they had discovered wooden structures at high altitude on Ararat, which they claimed, based on radiocarbon dating of wood samples, dated to roughly 4,800 years old. This announcement received global news coverage. It also received significant skepticism from professional archaeologists and geologists, who noted that the expedition's methods, sample handling, and excavation context had not been subjected to the same independent peer review and verification that any comparably significant archaeological claim would ordinarily require before being presented as confirmed discovery.
To date, no wood, structure, or artifact recovered from Mount Ararat, or from any competing site, has been independently authenticated by mainstream archaeological or geological institutions as confirmed physical remains of an ancient vessel. This is not the same as saying such remains could never exist, or that every claim made about them is made in bad faith. It is simply where the verified evidence currently stands, and any honest historian working in this field will tell you the same thing. So where does that leave us after all of this? What do historians, archaeologists, and religious scholars broadly agree on? And where does the genuine, unresolved mystery actually live? Here is what serious scholarship largely agrees on. Catastrophic regional flooding was a real, repeated, and formative experience for early civilizations across Mesopotamia and the wider ancient Near East, physically documented in excavated flood layers at multiple sites. Flood narratives, strikingly similar in structure, though different in theological detail, appear across an extraordinary range of ancient cultures, suggesting either shared ancient memory, shared human experience of catastrophic flooding, or, most likely, some combination of both. The Quranic account of Nuh stands as a coherent, morally focused telling of this story, emphasizing themes of patience, divine justice, and the cost of persistent unbelief, consistent with the Quran's broader treatment of earlier prophets.
and no physical site currently identified, whether Mount Judi, Mount Ararat, or the Durupınar Formation, has produced archaeological evidence that has met the standard of independent, peer-reviewed scientific verification required to confirm it as the Ark's actual resting place. Let's be equally clear about the myths that deserve to be retired. The claim that NASA or any government agency has confirmed the Ark's location and covered it up is not supported by any credible source and circulates purely as internet folklore. The claim that the Durupınar Formation has been scientifically proven to be a man-made vessel is not supported by mainstream, peer-reviewed geology. And the claim that archaeology has found zero evidence connected to this story at all is equally inaccurate, ignoring decades of genuine excavation revealing real, catastrophic flood layers across ancient Mesopotamia. The truth, as it so often is, sits in the more complicated space between total confirmation and total denial. Why, then, does this story still matter so deeply to so many people, nearly 4,000 years after the first flood tablets were pressed into wet clay? Perhaps because it was never only about a boat. Strip away the search for physical remains for a moment, and what's left is a story about a man asked to keep faith for 950 years while almost everyone around him refused to listen. A story about loss so personal that even a prophet had to watch someone he loved choose the wrong mountain instead of the ark. A story about beginning again from almost nothing after the water finally recedes. Every civilization that preserved a version of this story, separated by oceans, centuries, and languages that shared not a single word in common, seems to have reached for the same underlying truth: that destruction, however total it feels in the moment, is rarely the final word. That patience, even when it feels endless, matters. And that somewhere, even in humanity's darkest recorded memory, something was still worth saving. Archaeology may never fully close the case on where, or even whether, a physical ark still waits to be found. Geologists will keep studying sediment layers in Mesopotamia. Explorers will keep climbing Ararat's ice fields, chasing shadows the mountain has kept hidden for millennia, if they exist there at all. And scholars will keep debating exactly how these ancient flood traditions relate to one another, a conversation that has already lasted well over a century and shows no sign of ending soon. But maybe that unresolved mystery is exactly why this story has survived as long as it has. Not because every question has been answered, but because it never fully lets go of us in the first place. Somewhere between ancient clay tablets in a London museum case, a debated mountainside in eastern Turkey, and a story preserved word for word in the Qur'an for over 14 centuries, humanity has kept telling itself the same story again and again, refusing to let it disappear. Maybe some stories don't survive because we can prove them. Maybe they survive because, on some level, we still need them to be true. If history still has mysteries waiting beneath the surface, subscribe and join us as we keep searching for the evidence behind humanity's oldest and most enduring stories, one discovery at a time.